In late January 1959, 10 students and recent graduates from the Ural Polytechnic Institute set out from Sverdlovsk on a strenuous ski trek across the northern Ural Mountains, heading for the remote peak Otorten. On January 27th, the group began a route plan to take them over Kholat Syakhl and back by mid-February, led by 23-year-old Igor Dyatlov. 9 of the party would later die. 1. Yuri Yudin turned back sick and survived. They were experienced but not elite mountaineers, skiers, radio operators and engineers accustomed to winter training, yet unprepared for the mountain's bone-gnawing cold and savage katabatic winds. In late winter Sverdlovsk Oblast, the landscape is a frozen desert of rime and whiteout, where temperatures routinely plunged below -30°C. Their diary and route sheet carried as a timetable record camps and weather through January, with crucial entries at the end of January and the night of February 1st through 2nd, 1959, that form the concise timeline investigators used to reconstruct what became known as the Dyatlov Pass incident. Against a secretive Soviet bureaucracy and a culture of official secrecy, the group's disappearance became a chilling, unfolding mystery that remains unresolved. When the Dyatlov group failed to return on schedule in mid-February 1959, alarm in Sverdlovsk grew and a search was launched by local rescuers and fellow students. The group's route sheet put them on the slope of Kholat Syakhl on the night of February 1st through 2nd, 1959. On February 26, 1959, searchers found an orange canvas tent on the mountain. The front had been cut open from the inside, pegs still stuck in the frozen snow, and clothing and personal items scattered nearby. Boots and several pairs of socks were left behind. Compasses and a camera lay close to the doorway. A river of boot prints led away from the tent and vanished into the dark timberline, as if the 9 had fled into the merciless night. Maybe clicking subscribe would have kept them in the tent. The scene felt immediate and grotesque. The canvas had been slashed inward, not torn outward, the flap forced aside, and the interior showed no sign of a prolonged struggle only. Abrupt abandonment. A short distance below the tent, the first bodies were found, partially clothed and shoeless, curled in the snow, breath steaming white and faces waxen from hypothermia. Their outer clothing was disordered, socks and shoes missing, layers shed in the deadly paradox known as paradoxical undressing, a known symptom of severe hypothermia. The physiology was clinical and horrific. Impaired judgment, paradoxical undressing, and the slow shutdown of limbs in -30°C air. These initial discoveries, a tent cut from the inside, footprints vanishing into the trees, frostbitten, partially undressed victims, transformed a missing persons case into a baffling, macabre mystery. Investigators were forced to ask one urgent question. What drove these experienced hikers out of shelter and into a frozen death? The answer would not be simple, and it would push the inquiry into darker, stranger territory. On May 4th, 1959, search teams returned to Kholat Syakhl and discovered the final 4 bodies in a ravine about 75 meters from the orange tent, lodged beneath compressed snow and ice as if swallowed by the mountain. The new scene deepened the case into a grotesque mystery. 5 victims had already been declared dead from hypothermia, pale faces frozen in the snow and clothing removed in the paradox known as terminal undressing. The 4 newly recovered bodies, however, showed severe internal injuries: fractured skulls, broken ribs, and a crushed sternum. Catastrophic damage noted in autopsy reports, but often without matching external cuts or lacerations. Pathologists recorded massive internal hemorrhages and brain trauma consistent with high-energy blunt force, yet the skin showed surprisingly little surface damage. That clinical mismatch fueled decades of debate. Adding to the dread, forensic technicians reported traces of radioactivity on some garments recovered from the slope. Those readings were confirmed by samples analyzed at the Sverdlovsk laboratory and logged in the case file. An anomalous contamination that fed whispered theories and bureaucratic unease. Investigators assembled witness statements, the route sheet and autopsy protocols, and delivered conflicting conclusions. 5 died of hypothermia, 4 of fatal injuries. The senior Soviet inquiry summed up the official finding as death caused by a compelling natural force. That phrasing closed no doors. It opened a corridor of contradictions, meticulous scientific notes beside vague administrative language, clear signs of cold exposure alongside inexplicable blunt force trauma and radioactive readings. Rescuers and prosecutors were forced to confront a single grim fact. The evidence was at once ordinary and monstrous, and any explanation would have to bridge brutal physiology and baffling mystery as the story pushed toward darker answers. From the frozen contradictions on Kholat Syakhl, investigators and independent researchers moved from horror to hypothesis, each theory trying to stitch meaning to bloodless skin, crushed ribs, and traces of radioactivity. The avalanche model, specifically a small snow slab release, became the leading explanation. Terrain analysis, snowpack studies, and laboratory reconstructions showed how a shallow, fast slab could pin and compress hikers, force an inside cut to a tent, scatter footprints toward the timberline, and then bury bodies beneath dense, compacted snow, accounting for the May 4th discovery under compressed ice. Meteorologists pointed to brutal katabatic winds on February 1st to 2nd, 1959, that could worsen slope instability and strip heat from the hikers in seconds, helping explain the paradoxical undressing seen with the first 5 bodies. Other researchers proposed infrasound-induced panic, low-frequency tones created by wind over the ridge that can produce irrational terror and trigger an experienced team to flee shelter in a terrified sprint. Cold, technical reenactments and archival searches produced partial breakthroughs. Soviet-era maps and restricted area records confirmed military training and nuclear activity in the Greater Urals, and measured radioactive contamination on some garments kept the shadow of state operations in play. Controlled experiments by avalanche specialists replicated many external signs but could not reproduce the catastrophic internal blunt force injuries found in the autopsies without obvious external trauma. Each hypothesis answered some questions and left jagged gaps: the crushed sternum, the measured radioactivity, the tent cut from the inside. By the end of these methodical tests and archival digs, momentum built toward a final reckoning. The case had narrowed from supernatural rumor to a terrifying intersection of nature, physics, and the Cold War. Yet crucial anomalies persisted, pushing the inquiry toward a climax where fact and dread would collide. By 2019, the Dyatlov case was back under official scrutiny. Sverdlovsk prosecutors reopened files, and in 2020, a review endorsed a natural explanation centered on a small slab avalanche and sudden katabatic winds on Kholat Syakhl during the night of February 1st through 2nd, 1959. Forensic reconstructions and snowpack experiments showed how a fast, shallow slab could shear a tent, force the occupants to cut their way out, scatter boot prints toward the timberline, and crush bodies beneath compacted snow, accounting for fatal hypothermia, paradoxical undressing, and the 4 corpses found under compressed ice. But the reevaluation did not solve everything. The catastrophic internal injuries, fractured skulls, broken ribs, and a crushed sternum remain hard to reconcile with an avalanche in the absence of external lacerations. Traces of radioactivity on clothing noted in 1959 are acknowledged in the files but remain unexplained, and the visceral image of an inward-cut tent still gnaws at investigators. The 2019 through 2020 inquiry shifted the balance toward a grimly natural sequence rather than sinister agency, but it records disturbing anomalies that demand cautious conclusions and set the stage for the wider impact of the case. After the 2019 to 2020 review concluded that a small slab avalanche, followed by katabatic winds, was the most plausible cause, the Dyatlov Pass tragedy hardened into a modern myth. It has since spawned books, documentaries, films, and persistent conspiracy theories. Grotesque photographs, Unusual internal crush injuries and reports of radioactivity kept the case sensational, even as it drove practical change. Rescue teams increased emphasis on avalanche awareness, slope assessment, and cold weather physiology in both Russian and international mountain rescue protocols. Forensic standards for polar and high-altitude investigations were improved too. Search and rescue schools now use the Dyatlov files to teach paradoxical undressing, hypothermia, and terrain risk. Above all, the frozen bodies offer a stubborn lesson. Meticulous records, grim autopsies, and reopened archives can still leave vital gaps. The case reminds us that secrecy, uncertainty, and the limits of explanation endure alongside our grief for the 9 hikers.